Harvard University History and Business Administration professor Neil Ferguson talks about the life and influence of financier Siegmund Warburg, whose London-based bank, S.G. Warburg, played an important role in rebuilding post-World War II Europe. The New York Historical Society in New York City hosts the 50-minute talk.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dale. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming tonight. It's a great pleasure to be with you in what turns out to be an extraordinarily appropriate venue. Now, you may not associate bankers with ethical culture, but what I propose to do this evening is to introduce you to a banker who was steeped in ethical culture and who I feel would have got on very well with Felix Adler, also a German-born Jew, who of course called this society into being. I want to begin by asking a very fundamental question, and that relates to how many of you know who Siegmund Warburg was. My guess is that it's only a minority of you who had heard of him before this evening. His name is much better known in London, where indeed he spent most of his financial career. But that's not really a sufficient explanation for the relative obscurity in New York of a man who was without question one of the towering figures of post-war world finance. I think the key has to do with our neglect of bankers as a fit subject for biography. Why write the biography of a banker as opposed, say, to a dictator or perhaps a great democratic leader, a prime minister or a president? Why write the biography of a banker when you could be writing the biography of a king or a princess or an actress? In order to show you how we attach importance to different kinds of historical figure, I want to show you some statistics. If you go, as I did recently, to the British Library's General Reference Collection catalogue and simply find out how many books have been written about these different people, you will be rather startled by the result. Hitler is the clear winner. 478 books appear in that catalogue about Adolf Hitler, pipping Stalin to the post for most storied dictator. Mussolini comes in with the bronze medal, edging out Mao. Winston Churchill, I'm afraid, beats your own Abraham Lincoln, but don't feel bad because Churchill was, of course, half American. Henry VIII is the most written about royal. He has 90 books about him. Diana, Princess of Wales, is quite a distant second on 39. Notice that that's only one more than Marilyn Monroe. But when we get to bankers, it's as if the biographers suddenly leave the library in embarrassment. There are 2 or maybe 3 books about Siegmund Warburg, 3 if you count Ron Cherner's book about the entire Warburg family, 2 if you only count my book, and Jacques Attali's biography of Warburg. An unusual book. Jacques Attali, incidentally, was for many years François Mitterrand's close confidant. It's an unusual book because it's a biography exclusively based, as far as I can tell, on the imagination. My book is based on reading my way through about 10,000 letters and diary entries and memoranda which Warburg kept in the course of his life. Unlike many financiers, I should explain, Warburg was a remarkably prolific writer, and that for a biographer is a huge advantage. Now, I don't really know quite why you would need to ask the question, why bankers? When you reflect on the events of the last 3 years, it should be obvious that bankers are historically important. And I would go so far as to say more important than actresses. Perhaps even more important than princesses. For if anything has shaped our lives in the last 3 years, it's been a financial crisis, which many people are inclined to blame entirely on bankers. Now, I'm not one of those people who thinks that bankers are solely responsible for a crisis that clearly was caused by a whole coalition of negligent groups, regulators, rating agencies, not forgetting the politicians who did so much to stoke the real estate bubble. But still, you would have a difficult job, I think you'll agree, writing the history of the last decade and leaving out Goldman Sachs. I'll take Goldman as an example, but it's just an example. I could equally well have taken any of the major financial institutions that have played such a dominant role in modern economic history. It has to be historically significant that on the eve of the crisis, the chief executive of Goldman Sachs was being paid 2,000 times the average income in this country. It has to be significant that a bank had net revenues greater than the gross domestic product of more than 100 countries. And it has to be significant that that institution, at a time of financial crisis, not only converted itself into a bank holding company from an investment bank, but also secured indirectly a bailout via the bailout of AIG at a time when the Treasury Secretary was the former Chief Executive Officer of that bank. Call me cranky, but I just think that's historically important. For some reason, Lloyd Blankfein's picture had disappeared from that last slide I showed you, which makes me feel slightly uneasy. I wonder what else has been removed and by whom. When Lloyd Blankfein was challenged by the Sunday Times in the now famous interview last year, he replied, ironically, I think, that he was just doing God's work, but public reaction, certainly in Britain, was not, I think, to detect the irony. And the fact that the bank then had to settle with the SEC for some $550 million to settle fraud charges tells you something very important about our times, about the bankers. When Rolling Stone magazine called Goldman Sachs the great vampire squid, I think that was a historically significant moment. I think that's a quotation that will appear in the history books. Another one that ought to appear is John Mack's famous declaration, which I heard him make. He made it in New York. We cannot control ourselves. You have to step in and control the street. I was stunned when I heard him say that, though I suppose in some ways it was better than claiming to be doing God's work. The collapse of public confidence, of public trust in bankers, is one of the most striking features of our time. If you look at opinion data, bankers are now less trusted by the public than journalists. And that takes some doing. I'm a historian. That's why I'm so engaged with and committed to the New York Historical Society. And what historians are best at doing is taking documents, the things that people leave behind, and making historical sense of them. Before I talk at all about Siegmund Warburg, I want to juxtapose his ethos, the financial ethos of his generation, with the ethos of the present generation. And there is no document that does this better, in my view, than the email correspondence of Fabrice Tour, Goldman Sachs trader and Übermensch. These emails, which were written to a quite large number of different girlfriends. He was diversified in that respect. As in so many others, are, I think, a better summation of the spirit of our age than any other document you could possibly find. In order to grasp the full charm of these documents, it's necessary to read them in a French accent. More and more leverage in the system. The entire edifice threatened to collapse at any moment. Only potential survivor, the fabulous Fab. Standing in the middle of all these complex, highly levered, exotic trade he creates, without necessarily understanding all the implications of these monstrosities. Anyway, not feeling too guilty about this. The real purpose of my job is to make capital markets more efficient and ultimately provide the US consumer with more efficient ways to leverage himself. So, there is a humble, noble, and ethical reason for my job. Huh. Amazing how good I am in convincing myself. Let me take you back to a lost world. The lost world that produced Siegmund Warburg, who grew up in the early 20th century in South Germany. He was part of a distinguished banking dynasty. The Warburgs had established themselves successfully in Hamburg in the 19th century and had, by the late 19th century, almost emerged from the shadow of the Rothschilds, the dominant Jewish banking dynasty of the 19th century. But Siegmund wasn't part of that Hamburg scene. His father was a sickly, idiosyncratic member of the dynasty, who would probably have been regarded as Meshuggah at that time. There he is with the young Siegmund and Siegmund's mother Lucy in the first picture. And because he was so clearly unsuited to the financial cut and thrust, he was sent to a kind of genteel exile in South Germany, in the Swabian countryside. And that's where Siegmund grew up, in an altogether different ambience, atmosphere from his relatives in Hamburg. From almost the first moment he read. He was a voracious reader, and I am here, above all else, to celebrate the book as a vehicle for the communication of culture and ethical culture. He married and flourished. He flourished not only as a banker, he hadn't really wanted to be a banker. He'd had literary and academic and even political ambitions, but circumstances obliged him to enter the family business. His father's savings were wiped out by the post-First World War hyperinflation of 1923, and his ambitions in Hamburg were dealt a lethal blow when the family bank of Warburg more or less went bust in the great banking crisis of 1930-31. And then after that, his hopes of any life in Germany at all were dashed by the advent of the National Socialist regime in 1933 and the subsequent so-called Aryanization of the Warburg family bank. So Siegmund's life course, like the life course of so many people in the mid-20th century, was fundamentally altered by inflation, depression, and totalitarianism. And he had to start over, almost from scratch, because it was so very hard for somebody of his religion leaving Germany to take money with him. So my story is a story of somebody who had to start over. And he chose to start over in London. It might very well have been New York, but his wise Swedish father-in-law, a man named Philipson, gave him outstanding advice. He saw that Warburg's skills would be more salient, would have more impact in the stuffier, clubbier, somewhat more sclerotic atmosphere of London. Maybe the truth is, if Siegmund had come to New York, there would have been more Siegmunds to compete with. But in London, as I will show you, he cut an extraordinary, almost unique figure in the post-war period. The New York side of the story is fascinating. Some of you will be familiar with it. Through his uncles, Paul and Felix, Siegmund Warburg was related to the Schiff family, and therefore had a direct interest in that extraordinary cousinhood that dominated Manhattan and particularly the financial world of the early 20th century. The firm of Kuhn Loeb and Company has vanished, gone the way of all flesh, along with more recent casualties like Lehman Brothers. But Kuhn Loeb was once a name to conjure with in this city. It was, in fact, a name on a par with J.P. Morgan in the days when Jacob Schiff, the great patriarch at the center of the family group, was the master of railroad finance in this city. So, for those of you who are dedicated to the study of New York history and New York history alone, this book has something for you. What it has is a tale of failure. Siegmund Warburg's failure to persuade his Schiff relatives, and particularly John Schiff, one of the children in that photograph at the bottom, that he had to change Kuhn Loeb or it would die. It's an extraordinary drama, a transatlantic drama. Warburg became a director of Kuhn Loeb, spent weeks and months in New York trying to turn the firm around, and ultimately failed, was ultimately thwarted by his own relatives. The rest, if you want to follow that story, is in the book. So the scene after the failure to turn Kuhn Loeb around shifts to London. And it's a tale of resurrection. Resurrection of the City of London as a financial centre. My argument is that nobody contributed more to the revival of London as the world's great international financial centre than Siegmund Warburg. In a whole series of innovations, he turned London around. And to grasp the magnitude of his achievement, you need to recognize that in 1945, London was pretty much finished, or seemed finished, as a financial center. A bankrupt country with a socialist government, capital controls, exchange controls, rationing of everything, hardly seemed like a place that would rise to rival New York in the post-war period, that it did owe much to Warburg. Siegmund Warburg made a distinction which will be familiar to many of you between two kinds of banking: transactions banking and relationship banking. And the interesting thing is that in his mind, transactions banking was an earlier model that could be blamed for the Depression. And relationship banking, from the vantage point of the 1950s, was the future. We often tend to think of it as the other way round. Relationship banking was something slightly old-fashioned and fuddy-duddy that was swept away in the heroic days of the 1980s and 1990s. Viewed from the vantage point of Warburg's generation, this is the wrong way to think of it. Viewed from that vantage point, we reran the experiment with transactions banking with the same result. If financial institutions are dominated by volume transactions, piling them high and selling them cheap, or more likely selling them dear, if relationships with clients are replaced purely by transactions with counterparties, don't be surprised if you come close to another Great Depression. The distinction set out very clearly here in one of Warburg's memoranda on the subject. Transactions banking was just about channeling money. Relationship banking was about changing and adjusting management and capital structures of industrial and financial businesses to alterations in our environments. To him, that was the true purpose of banking. Personally, he wrote in 1964, I'm not interested in the waves of despondency and enthusiasm. These are appropriate for people who look upon matters purely from a stock exchange point of view. However, if we want to succeed, meaning the bank that took his name after the war, S.G. Warburg and Company, we must make up our mind to follow a policy of establishing new values and new procedures rather than to act mainly as traders and sellers of securities, which we find relatively easy to dispose of. In other words, we must be aware that we are primarily bankers and only secondarily stock exchange traders. One way of understanding the history of our time, ladies and gentlemen, is that the traders took over from the bankers, with results we all now know. Well, let me briefly tell you what this bank did. It was a small firm by modern standards. Small in terms of the capital, small in terms of the number of employees, small because Warburg believed that small was beautiful and that financial institutions should not be too large. It was a bank that did a lot of fee-based corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions. He pioneered the hostile takeover as an art form in post-war London. It was an asset management firm, though he rather disapproved of that side of the business. The Eurobond market, which was an enormously vital market for harnessing the accumulated dollars in the continent and elsewhere and putting them to work, was in large measure his bank's invention. He also pioneered an entirely different way of managing a bank internally. Banks in his early years were more like gentlemen's clubs. The partners sat in oak-panelled rooms, and the clerks were in a different floor and never ever had anything to do with the partners. The major senior employees would turn up at about 10 a.m., have the first pre-dinner, pre-lunch drink at about 12, and be thinking about the golf course by about 4. Warburg changed all that. Open plan offices, an egalitarian structure in which all directors, no matter how senior or junior, had equal voice. He changed the culture of banking. He made them start work early. So this is an extraordinary story of innovation, financial innovation, of which I think was of a positive nature. One fee which we earn from giving good service to one of our large industrial clients can be far in excess of what we earn in a whole year in connection with Eurobond issues. For Warburg, relationships with corporate clients were the key. It was a profitable bank. This chart shows you real net profits adjusted for inflation, and you can see what extraordinarily buoyant years the 50s and 60s were, and what a struggle the 70s were. You can also see that the share price tracked that performance pretty much exactly. It was a great thing to buy a share in the parent company Mercury Securities in the 50s or early 60s. It was rather tougher to hang on to it during the 1970s when double-digit inflation caused so much trouble to the UK economy. But ladies and gentlemen, it's not the performance of the bank I want to focus on, because that's not what Siegmund Warburg focused on. I was very puzzled when I was writing this book, because as I read through Siegmund Warburg's letters and diaries and memoranda, I couldn't find any references at all to the bottom line. In fact, he hardly ever talked about money. Sums, fees, profits, cash flow, it's not there. And for about 3 years, I couldn't write the book. I was paralyzed. How could I write a book about a banker who didn't appear to care about money? Who on earth would want to read that? And then, slowly, as I suspect only comes from immersion in documentary sources, I began to get it. I began to see that for Warburg, the bottom line was not the most important thing. It was something that would take care of itself if you did things right. In a wonderful memorandum to John Schiff in 1953, Siegmund Warburg set out what he called the important elements of a first-class private banking business. These were the 5 haute banque principles. Haute banque was a phrase he loved, and that's why the book is called High Financier. Number 1, moral standing. Number 2, reputation for efficiency and high-quality brainwork. Number 3, connections. Number 4, capital funds. Number 5, personnel and organization. Of those 5, I think it is fair to say that most institutions in the financial world over the past 20 or so years dropped number 1 and number 4. By the time they were done, all they were left with was the connections. I want to talk about each of these in turn, but the most important by far was moral standing. Can you imagine any of today's financial geniuses putting moral standing first? Is moral standing a phrase that Fab Tour would use in emails to his many girlfriends? I think not. The basic conception of our firm has always been founded on the following principles. Success. Success from the financial and from the prestige point of view, important and self-understood as it is not enough. What matters even more is constructive achievement and adherence to high moral and aesthetic standards in the way in which we do our work. For me, that was the aha moment, the moment I suddenly got it. Yes, of course, the bottom line is important, but you don't really need to think about it all the time. It's a necessary byproduct of adherence to high moral and aesthetic standards. High quality work. I don't want you to get the idea that I'm delivering a sermon and that this book is some kind of austere moral code for future bankers. It is also fun. It's fun because Warburg's was a fun place to work. Fun, although it was hard work and sometimes terrifying work, because of this kind of thing. Peter Stormont Darling was a relatively junior director. One day he was at home when the phone rang, and it was his boss. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you." "Oh no, Mr. Warburg, not at all." "Well, it's about your note dated 22nd December on the American stock market. Do you have a copy in front of you?" No, I'm afraid my copy's in the office." "Well, let me remind you of your second sentence in the 5th paragraph. I think there should be a comma after the word development." Now, this is in itself a characteristic bit of Warburg pedantry, but what makes this story significant is that this happened on Christmas Day. Perfectionism, an obsession with precision grammar and syntax and spelling and punctuation, was one of the trademarks of S.G. Warburg. And that seems to me to be an important point about this man. His belief that if one pursued perfection, even aesthetic perfection in the letters you wrote to the Bank of England, then the bank would be bound to succeed. The pursuit of perfection seems to me to be one of the keys to understanding his personality. Point number 3, connections. Most of the substantial transactions which have been done by us are the result of the cultivation of contacts over very many years. It is, of course, important that the technical details of a transaction are dealt with in the most thorough and painstaking manner possible, but this should not make us forget that this would be fruitless without human contact with the client in question. In our kind of business, the continuity of valuable connections overrides in importance the conclusion of any specific transactions. And there you have it. The essence of the difference between a transactions-based model and a relationships-based model. It's that cultivation of relationships which Warburg saw as central to the activity of a banker. In fact, he frequently compared himself to a physician, to a doctor, and would describe his relationship to corporate clients as like the relationship between a doctor and a patient. I am not impressed by profits earned in a business which carried undue liquidity risks. Memo to Dick Fools. The entire financial system in 2006-07 was taking massive risks in terms of liquidity, and hardly anybody noticed. When you look at the balance sheets of the firms that blew up in 2008, they were so leveraged and so reliant on short-term financing, you can hardly believe they did it. So, I'm taking you back in this book to a time when bankers really worried about liquidity. Here's another example of Warburg fun. It is always wrong to look at the bright side of the picture. I can relate to that as a Scotsman completely. One always risks being tempted into complacency, not you of course, but some of our colleagues, if they see that for the last 25 years our non-recurring profits have each year recurred on an ever-growing scale, may end up considering this as a normal state of affairs. Now that wasn't actually Warburg, that was one of the other German refugee directors, Charles Sharp, Karl Spitz as he was originally known, who used to write sketches making fun of the Warburg culture. Every now and then the mood would take him and he would write these wonderful satirical comedies in which the foibles of the firm's chief would be satirized. How many firms in the financial world today produce quality satire in-house? And the way in which it was organized, the way this bank was run, is a fantastically interesting combination of the culture of the Jewish refugees, not only Warburg, but his partner, Henry Grunfeld, and the others who'd come in the 1930s. And on the other side, the culture of the public schoolboys that they recruited from Winchester, from Eton, and the rest. The public schoolboys treated the German and Austrian refugees like the housemasters at a particularly eccentric public school. And so the Monday morning meeting that they all had to attend was referred to as morning prayers. This culture, I think, was a highly creative and in many ways appealing one. It was a culture that valued above all brains, but also the written word. There was an extraordinary transparency of communication at Warburg's. All the ingoing and outgoing correspondence was pooled, everybody could read it, and everybody was expected to read it. There was little reliance on the telephone. If the telephone was used, a memorandum had to be written. And they had a rule of 4. In which any transaction had to be signed off by 4 directors of the company. All of this is, to me, fascinating and more important than, let us say, the sex life of Marilyn Monroe. It's important in 2 ways. It's important because it tells us how the financial world changed in the transition from the culture that had produced the Depression to the culture that produced the glory years of the post-war economy. And it's important also because it tells us what we're lost in the generation after Warburg and his contemporaries faded from the scene. He died in 1982. I calculated that the average duration of the career of a chief executive of a major American bank in 2007, on the eve of the crisis, was 25 years. They had basically all come in to the financial world the year that Siegmund Warburg died. Where did it come from? Where did that sense of an ethical framework come from? What can we do to produce that kind of framework in the next generation of financiers? Partly it came from experience, ladies and gentlemen. If you had lived through hyperinflation, depression, and the rise of Hitler, you would probably be quite risk-averse. But it wasn't just that. It was also the way he was brought up. To me, the most moving document that I read when I was writing this book was a document in which Warburg remembered what his mother had said to him on the eve of his bar mitzvah. I want to quote it to you, and I want you to memorize it. And I want you to say it to your children and your grandchildren. From now on, my dear boy, you must pray alone in the evening. And you must always ask yourself before you pray, what mistakes you have made during the preceding day or what you could have done better. If a whole number of mistakes or omissions do not at once occur to you, then you must look deeper into yourself until you have attained the necessary self-knowledge. We all make many mistakes every day, and the most important thing is to be critical of your own mistakes in the most unsparing way. That is the only way to arrive at honest prayer. Siegmund Warburg grew up believing that you should always cry over spilt milk, and you should always cross bridges before you came to them. I think that's because of his mother. And perhaps, if today's bankers had had mothers like Lucy Warburg, we might not be in quite the economic mess that we're in. Now, with that, I'm going to thank you for your attention and invite you to ask me difficult questions. Thank you very much. The rules of the game are as follows. Someone other than me will choose who asks the questions. You just have to raise your hands. If you are chosen, a microphone will magically appear in your hand. When the microphone appears in your hand, please stand up so that C-SPAN and a waiting nation can see who you are. And then when you begin to speak, remember the object of the exercise is to ask a question, not to make a speech or give a lecture. That's me. I do that. So, questions, please.
You mentioned the effect that his mother had on him. What was his effect on his children?
That's a great question. What was his effect on his children? I learnt a lot from writing this book over 12 years as a father. And one of the things I learned, which is very important, is that when you have a son, you have not cloned yourself. Many men make the mistake of thinking that their son, particularly their firstborn son, is a clone, and they expect that son to be the same as them. And I think Siegmund Warburg made that mistake. I don't say that he wasn't a loving father, but his expectations of his son George, I think ultimately were not realistic and didn't take account of his son's character and temperament. And at the heart of the book, there is, I think, not a tragic relationship, that would be much too strong, but a painful and fascinating study in how a father-son relationship can be undermined by unrealistic expectations and a failure to make the imaginative leap that recognizes your son as someone quite different. So, when I began this book, before I had really done the research, I know I put too much pressure on my son about homework, particularly history homework. And I remember reading some of the letters between Siegmund and George and thinking, I'm going to make exactly the same mistake if I'm not careful. So no, I think he was a very good son, in many ways the perfect son. But as a father, I think he asked too much, or maybe just asked the wrong things. His daughter Anna, I think, had an altogether better deal. Perhaps because she was more like him, but also because she was a daughter, and therefore not expected to be a clone. In answering that question, I hope I've made it clear that even if you're not terribly interested in finance at all, and don't care what a Eurobond is, this is a book full of human drama. The drama of exile, the drama that comes when you lose your homeland and the culture which you feel so closely bound up with, and also the drama that I suppose every family has going on within it. Thanks very much. Another question, please. Yes, madam.
Do you hope that this book is a blueprint for today's bankers to start to turn things around?
Well, I think calling it a blueprint for today's bankers would be putting it a bit strongly. The world has changed in many ways and continues relentlessly to change in ways that are, I think, in many respects disturbing. The fact that the bulk of trades on the New York Stock Exchange today are executed by algorithms in microseconds should worry us. The degree to which the transactions model has somehow triumphed despite the crisis should trouble us. The degree to which it's hard today to set up a new bank should trouble us. It's hard because if you were Siegmund Warburg today, and after all, he started his bank after a depression, you would find the odds were stacked against you by the too-big-to-fail institutions that enjoy all kinds of open and not-so-open subsidies from government. So a blueprint's probably not realistic. But what I do feel very passionately about is that when we consider business education, and I am half of my time at Harvard a professor at the business school, we should be making our students more aware of financial history. History has been a neglected part of business education for far too long, but also we should make them aware of the ethical framework that any businessman needs to operate within if he's not to be just a Bernie Madoff who didn't get found out. So it's not a blueprint, but I hope that it is something that people will read and take to heart. If it makes some of its readers uncomfortable, if it makes them aware of what was absent from their decision-making process before, then good. Whether they'll read it, I don't know. Maybe a one-page executive summary would be a good idea. But I hope that if not a blueprint, at least it will serve as a reminder that finance wasn't always amoral. You know, there is a danger in a crisis like this that we swing to the opposite extreme. We conclude that all bankers are crooks, that all banks are untrustworthy, that the crisis was entirely the fault of these people and they all belong in jail. And that's as absurd as to believe that markets are always efficient and always for the best and the best of all possible stock markets, which was our previous pre-crisis era. No, I think it's very important to recognize the value of the financial institutions that we have. One of the things I tried to argue in The Ascent of Money was that finance has been an integral part of human progress, that financial innovation on balance has been for good and not for evil. And writing Warburg was a chance to kind of zoom in and make that same point in microcosm, because I think he personifies the kind of finance that has been of real and lasting benefit to mankind. Thanks. Yes, please.
Mr. Ferguson, I have recently written a biography of Francis Yates, who, as you know, was affiliated with the Warburg Institute for many years. And until I have the pleasure of reading your book, I have a couple of quick questions. Where are Siegmund's papers housed?
Yes.
What led you to him? What was his relationship with Abby Warburg?
Yes.
And did he have any affiliation with the Warburg Institute?
I'm always impressed when someone can pack 4 questions into one. I must tell you, madam, that I once was asked a question by a German who managed to get 9 in, and that's the record. Warburg's papers are in London. It's likely, though not certain, that they'll leave the Hatton Garden archive where they're currently held and will go to a university collection in the UK. I tried and failed to get them to the Morgan Library at the Harvard Business School. The reason I wrote the book was that after my Rothschild book was published, I wrote a history of the Rothschild Bank, some of Warburg's former colleagues approached me with the idea that I might write a biography. And at first I was rather reluctant, but when I sat down and read his diary of 1933, I was absolutely thunderstruck. If you want to get a sense of how intensely confusing it was to be a young, brilliant, ambitious German Jew in 1933, just read the quotations in my book from his diary. That was what persuaded me I should write the book. The Abby Warburg connection was not as close as the connection with Abby's younger brother, Paul. The 5 brothers, for those of you who don't know the Warburg story, were like a kind of rerun of the 5 sons of Meyer Amschel Rothschild, except that they didn't all go into finance because they had wider opportunities in the late 19th century. And Abbe was the one who was least suited to finance and most intensely academic. And as you know, but others may not know, his more financially savvy brother Max made a deal that Max would take over the family bank and he would provide Abbe with a lifetime supply of all the books he wanted. This open-ended commitment was one of the worst deals that Max Warburg ever did because his brother's library is absolutely vast. The library ended up in London and became the basis for the Warburg Institute because it obviously had to be rescued from the clutches of the Nazis. It then became a home for modern art history, in many ways the home. If you know anything of art history, you'll know the work of Ernst Gombrich, who was, for many years, based at the Warburg Institute. Oh, and by the way, if you haven't read Gombrich's Little History of the World, do. It's a masterpiece. And I think I've answered all of your questions. No, he was not. Fourth question, he did not have any link to the Warburg Institute and donated his own library, which was also very large. Siegmund collected books almost as enthusiastically as Abbey, but he donated his library to St. Paul's Girls' School in London, where his daughter went. 4 out of 4. Would anybody else like to ask 4 questions? Yes, sir.
In the United States over much of the 20th century, after bankers achieved some professional success, they often sought to move more into public life and influence public policy, at least up until Henry Paulson, and maybe they're going to revisit those attempts. But did Siegmund ever harbor any of these ambitions, and did he do anything outside of the banking sphere?
Yes, that's a great question. He did. In fact, he had hoped to be a politician. In the late 20s and early 30s, his plan was to use the bank as the launching pad for a political career as a liberal politician. He would have been in the German Democratic Party, the DDP. And of course, all of that fell apart for the reasons we know. He never ceased to be politically engaged. He was a passionate believer in European unity. Indeed, the Warburgs were among the most important benefactors of a man who's now largely forgotten, Count Coudenhove-Kalergi, who was the prophet of pan-European unity in the 20s and 30s. After the war, Siegmund Warburg was convinced that European unity could only be brought about by economic means. He felt the lesson of the 1930s was that nationalism was too powerful in Europe. And so he was very active in the economic integration of Europe. In one of the chapters in the book, I try to show how institutions like the Eurobond market and cross-border mergers in business were, for Warburg, means to an end of European unity. And although he did become disillusioned with the way the European economic community turned out in the 1970s, he still believed that that was a desirable goal. Perhaps most interestingly, he became a kind of behind-the-scenes advisor to the Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson during the 1960s. This is the most, from a British reader's point of view, extraordinary revelation of all. It's probably a bit lost on a US audience, and I don't want to sound like a provincial Brit, but Harold Wilson made regular attacks on bankers. And one of his most famous attacks was when he blamed what he called the gnomes of Zurich. The gnomes of Zurich is a wonderful phrase, for a sterling crisis in 1967. Well, while he was denouncing the gnomes of Zurich, behind the scenes, and wholly unknown to other members of the government, he was dining with Siegmund Warburg, who was his back-channel advisor. And I even found a wonderful occasion when Warburg brought a Swiss banker to London to meet Wilson so that Wilson could see what a gnome of Zurich was really like. So there's a lot of politics in the book, European politics, British politics, and also Cold War politics. 2 interesting points. Unlike some other financiers, Warburg was absolutely unrelenting in his hostility to communism. He would do no business with any communist regime, period. Second fascinating point. In the early 1970s crisis in the Middle East, some of you will know that a boycott was one weapon that the Arab League deployed, in addition, of course, to the oil price hike. The boycott was directed against Jewish banks. And one of the banks singled out was S.G. Warburg, along with Rothschilds and others. So Warburg found himself in the very midst of the great Middle Eastern crisis, facing the real possibility of kidnapping, even assassination. And I'm fascinated by the way in which he dealt with that problem. He and his fellow directors were extraordinarily quick to phone up and harangue any non-Jewish bank that appeared to be appeasing the Arab League. The most obvious way in which this happened would be that banks would drop Warburgs or Rothschilds from the consortia that were set up for major bond and stock issues. And Warburg was absolutely unforgiving towards anybody who showed signs of caving in to that kind of moral blackmail. So there's a lot of politics in the story, and I think that's one reason that I was drawn to it. I suspect I have time for one more question, Dale.
What was the relationship of political contributions in Warburg's time as it is today? We know when AIG was bailed out, Blankfein, Paulson, and other Goldman Sachs people were there and made sure that our money that was given to AIG was given to them at 100% when everyone else didn't get theirs. And if we want to blame the Bush administration, there is an excellent film which I saw last night at the New York Film Festival, Inside Job, in which the person who backed Obama when he ran points out that none of these people in the Obama administration have been investigated for all the fraud they committed. And if one looks at the political contributions of Goldman in the last election, it went mainly to the Democrats and Obama. So what was the relationship? Maybe that is the key question. Follow the money. What happened to money in politics in Warburg's time in contrast to ours?
Well, I haven't seen the film that you mentioned, and it's clear that it will take financial historians a great deal of time satisfactorily to unravel the relationships between the banks, the politicians, congressmen, and members of the executive during the financial crisis. We already know from some of the excellent books like Andrew Ross Sorkin's that the relations were too close for comfort. We also know, thanks to the transparency of the American political system, who gave what to whom, to a degree which is almost unknown in Europe. Now, I was amazed to find in 2007-8, when all this began, and I was involved in a debate on whether Wall Street or Washington had caused the crisis, I was amazed to find the scale of the contributions from AIG and other institutions, not least Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to key figures in Congress, who are, of course, the authors of the financial reform bill, Barney Frank and Christopher Dodd. I mean, these are some of the biggest recipients of money from major financial institutions. So go figure. Is this new? No. No, it's not new. One of the points that I tried to make in The Ascent of Money is that the nexus between finance and politics goes all the way back to the Medici, and it carries all the way through the 18th century, the age of John Law, the 19th century, the age of Nathan and James Rothschild, the 20th century, the age of Morgan and Kuhn Loeb, and so forth. This is a problem at the heart of our capitalist democracy. And the biggest problem of all is the peril that we oversimplify it. That in our frustrations, we swing to populist extremes. We say democracy is corrupt, and Jewish finance corrupts it. That, of course, was precisely the argument that Hitler made. And there were books aplenty in the late 1920s and early 1930s trying to prove the extent to which democracy was in thrall to Jewish finance. My role as a historian, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, Dale, my role as an historian is to focus on that relationship between finance and politics, between capitalism and democracy, to show its true historical nature and complexity, and to steer a literate public away from populist oversimplifications of the sort that might fuel, well, let's say, a tea party these days. Thank you very much indeed.
Neil Ferguson is History and Business Administration Professor at Harvard Business School. His books include Colossus, The Rise and Fall of the American Empire, and The Ascent of Money, A Financial History of the World. For more information, visit neilferguson.com.
This weekend on Book TV, Alison Dagnes on whether
Subject for biography. Why write the biography of a banker, as opposed, say, to a dictator, or perhaps a great democratic leader, a prime minister, or a president? Why write the biography of a banker when you could be writing the biography of a king, or a princess, or an actress? In order to show you how we attach importance to different kinds of historical figure, I want to show you some statistics. If you go, as I did recently, to the British Library's General Reference Collection catalogue and simply find out how many books have been written about these different people, you will be rather startled by the result. Hitler is the clear winner. 478 books appear in that catalogue about Adolf Hitler, pipping Stalin to the post for most storied dictator. Mussolini comes in with the bronze medal edging out Mao. Winston Churchill, I'm afraid, beats your own Abraham Lincoln, but don't feel bad because Churchill was, of course, half American. Henry VIII is the most written about royal. He has 90 books about him. Diana, Princess of Wales, is quite a distant second on 39. Notice that that's only one more than Marilyn Monroe. But when we get to bankers, it's as if the biographers suddenly leave the library in embarrassment. There are 2 or maybe 3 books about Siegmund Warburg, 3 if you count Ron Cherner's book about the entire Warburg family, 2 if you only count my book, and Jacques Attali's biography of Warburg. An unusual book. Jacques Attali, incidentally, was for many years François Mitterrand's close confidant. It's an unusual book because it's a biography exclusively based, as far as I can tell, on the imagination. My book is based on reading my way through about 10,000 letters and diary entries and memoranda which Warburg kept in the course of his life. Unlike many financiers, I should explain, Warburg was a remarkably prolific writer, and that, for a biographer, is a huge advantage. Now, I don't really know quite why you would need to ask the question, why bankers? When you reflect on the events of the last 3 years, it should be obvious that bankers are historically important. And I would go so far as to say more important than actresses. Perhaps even more important than princesses. For if anything has shaped our lives in the last 3 years, it's been a financial crisis, which many people are inclined to blame entirely on bankers. Now, I'm not one of those people who thinks that bankers are solely responsible for a crisis that clearly was caused by a whole coalition of negligent groups, regulators, rating agencies, not forgetting the politicians who did so much to stoke the real estate bubble. But still, you would have a difficult job, I think you'll agree, writing the history of the last.
Harvard University History and Business Administration professor Neil Ferguson talks about the life and influence of financier Siegmund Warburg, whose London-based bank, S.G. Warburg, played an important role in rebuilding post-World War II Europe. The New York Historical Society in New York City hosts the 50-minute talk.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dale. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming tonight. It's a great pleasure to be with you in what turns out to be an extraordinarily appropriate venue. Now, you may not associate bankers with ethical culture, but what I propose to do this evening is to introduce you to a banker who was steeped in ethical culture and who I feel would have got on very well with Felix Adler, also a German-born Jew, who of course called this society into being. I want to begin by asking a very fundamental question, and that relates to how many of you know who Siegmund Warburg was. My guess is that it's only a minority of you who had heard of him before this evening. His name is much better known in London, where indeed he spent most of his financial career. But that's not really a sufficient explanation for the relative obscurity in New York of a man who was without question one of the towering figures of post-war world finance. I think the key has to do with our neglect of bankers as a fit decade and leaving out Goldman Sachs. I'll take Goldman as an example, but it's just an example. I could equally well have taken any of the major financial institutions that have played such a dominant role in modern economic history. It has to be historically significant that on the eve of the crisis, the chief executive of Goldman Sachs was being paid 2,000 times the average income in this country. It has to be significant that a bank had net revenues greater than the gross domestic product of more than 100 countries. And it has to be significant that that institution, at a time of financial crisis, not only converted itself into a bank holding company from an investment bank, but also secured indirectly a bailout via the bailout of AIG at a time when the Treasury Secretary was the former chief executive officer of that bank. Call me cranky, but I just think that's historically important. For some reason, Lloyd Blankfein's picture had disappeared from that last slide I showed you, which makes me feel slightly uneasy. I wonder what else has been removed and by whom. When Lloyd Blankfein was challenged by the Sunday Times in the now famous interview last year, he replied, ironically I think, that he was just doing God's work, but public reaction certainly in Britain was not, I think, to detect the irony. And the fact that the bank then had to settle with the SEC for some $550 million to settle fraud charges tells you something very important about our times, about the bankers. When Rolling Stone magazine called Goldman Sachs the great vampire squid, I think that was a historically significant moment. I think that's a quotation that will appear in the history books. Another one that ought to appear is John Mack's famous declaration, which I heard him make. He made it in New York. We cannot control ourselves. You have to step in and control the street. I was stunned when I heard him say that, though I suppose in some ways it was better than claiming to be doing God's work. The collapse of public confidence, of public trust in bankers, is one of the most striking features of our time. If you look at opinion data, bankers are now less trusted by the public than journalists. And that takes some doing. I'm a historian. That's why I'm so engaged with and committed to the New York Historical Society. And what historians are best at doing is taking documents, the things that people leave behind, and making historical sense of them. Before I talk at all about Siegmund Warburg, I want to juxtapose his ethos, the financial ethos of his generation, with the ethos of the present generation. And there is no document that does this better, in my view, than the email correspondence of Fabrice Tour, Goldman Sachs trader and Übermensch. These emails, which were written to a quite large number of different girlfriends, he was diversified in that respect, as in so many others, are, I think, a better summation of the spirit of our age